Our last but not least panel is how we move forward and lessons from the past. And I think, it really, the question is, are there lessons from the past in talking about the human impact of a potential fiscal crisis? And are there ways in which thinking about the fiscal situation in human terms could help get us to the solution that I think we all agree is, we might not agree on what solution is necessary, but I think we all agree that some solution is better than the current piddling along and sticking our heads in the sand. So we have a terrific group to be able to address this question. Norm Ornstein from the American Enterprise Institute, who knows more about Congress than the rest of us have forgotten. Bill Haugland, I could actually introduce the same way. I remember the first time I met Bill in this horrible little hideaway makes it sound glamorous, but what I mostly remember were like steam pipes that were basically running through your under the alcove kind of garret in the Capitol, where he handed me 2 charts that showed everything that you needed to know about covering the budget. One of them was the classic chart about the growth of Medicare and Social Security, and the other was this magnificent rendition, which I think I still have on my wall, of the congressional budget process. It was a keeper. Bill was a budget guru on the Hill for many, many years and is now at Cigna, where he continues, in fact, to be a budget guru, because you can't take that away from anybody. Joe Minerick, my new friend as of yesterday, but my failure to have connected with him in the past. Senior Vice President, Research Director for the Committee on Economic Development, and also with a stellar resume of budgeting efforts from Congress to OMB, and some great stories about those. And finally, our PowerPointer, Scott Biddle, Director of Public Issues Analysis at Public Agenda, which has dived with both feet into the question of the fiscal situation. So Scott's going to start because he's the PowerPointer, and then everybody is going to get on stage and talk together.
There's always one, isn't there? I do apologize, and in the spirit of productivity and austerity, I will actually skip some of my slides. I think the fundamental issue about the budget, if we talk about it to the public, is that there are 2 games going on here. And I want to stick up for the public a little bit today, because I've been sitting and listening to people talk about all the polling data, the contradictory responses. The public doesn't know what it wants. It doesn't even know what it doesn't know. How do we get anything done here? I think it's understandable, actually, and I think I can explain a little bit why. As I say, there are 2 games going on here, and they don't actually relate to each other. There's the inside the Beltway game. And when I say Beltway, I actually do extend it a little bit to the financial world, which is heavily invested in this. And that's about getting to a deal in Washington. It's focused on details. It's focused on bargaining positions. All the stuff that happened in the Senate yesterday is a perfect example. The public is focused on this very differently. The public's is only, it's important to understand, the public is only partly paying attention. They have lives. And having lives does not help you dive into the details of policy issues like the federal budget. And they're more concerned with values and consequences than the tactical maneuvering, which is mostly what they hear about. So what you have are parallel conversations going on that don't match up. I'm going to kind of give you a model that helps this public opinion data make sense a little bit. And this draws on the work of Public Agenda's founder, Dan Yankelovich, who's one of the great names of public opinion research in the United States. And he has developed this theory about how the public processes issues. And it is a process. You start off with consciousness raising. In other words, you're first hearing about an issue. You then move through, what are you going to do about it? And you start hearing more about it, and you start hearing trade-offs, and you start finding out more facts. You maybe talk about it with your friends. You start doing this process of weighing what's going on. And eventually, you reach the point where you've come to firm conclusions. Makes sense. The thing is that this process has a lot that can go wrong with it. People need facts, they need a sense of choices, and most of all, they need time, because they're not wonks. You learn very quickly on something you're focused on. You learn less quickly on things you're not focused on. Almost everybody in this room, frankly, is up at the area of resolution. We know what we think ought to be done. We all have firm opinions. We've weighed our options. The public is back here in the working through phase. It's an improvement. A couple years ago, they were in the consciousness raising phase on the budget. If you looked at the survey data, you didn't know, most people did not know there was a problem. The survey results you see now, these kind of contradictory results where people say the deficit's a problem, but they don't like any of the solutions, are a classic sign of the working through phase. I mean, you can track all these phases with polling data. And that is a classic sign. When you have contradictory results, when the results change based on question wording, when you have these signs of conflict, it's not that people can't understand this issue, it's that they're still working through it. And with respect to Ruth, who talked about some of the polling results earlier and called them lunacy. I don't think it's lunacy. I think it's learning. Clumsy, slow, halting learning as they move up this curve and figure things out. But as you see, there's lots of things that can get in the way. It's maybe not as urgent as other problems. There are lots of people trying to confuse the issue. They don't understand the choices. They may be in denial. They may not trust where they're getting information from. All those things slow the process down. So when we talk about the inside game and the outside game, how do we get to the point where A, we have a deal that can actually pass, and B, it's a deal that the public can live with and buy into? The public needs a few key things to move up the learning curve. They need some facts. They don't need to be budget wonks, but they need some basic facts. They need a sense of proportion. They need to know what's a big part of the budget and what's a small part of the budget. This is why you get these results where people always overestimate foreign aid, for example, because they don't have those basics. They don't know, largely, tax rates are historically low. They don't know what's driving the long-term problem. Once you have those basics, you have a context for understanding the news. People also need a few other critical things. One of the things is the Washington debate is about programs, and it's about bargaining and things like that. For the public, it's about priorities. The public will never be as good at getting into the details of programs as the experts. And why should they be? It's not their job. But what they can do, what they should do, and what we need them to do is set priorities. In other words, How should the government be spending its money? What are the most important things to do? And how do we pay for them? That they can get their minds around. I mean, a few weeks ago, I think it was Ezra Klein at the Washington Post, who referred to, if you looked at the federal budget, you would assume that the government was an insurance company with a standing army. And if the current trends continue, we'll end up with a heavily leveraged insurance company with a standing army. Those may or may not be the priorities of the American public, but they need to weigh in. If that's not what they want, they need to help change course. They need to buy in to what it takes to change course. And the most important thing is a sense of options. What are the real options here? And so much of the debate in Washington is about taking options off the table. Don't talk about this. Don't talk about that. And let's argue about, as so many people point out today, this slice of discretionary funding, which is not, in fact, the core of the problem. I think that when we talk about the human face of the fiscal crisis, part of that human face are the average citizens sitting at home trying to figure out what all this means to them and what their role is and what they're supposed to do about it. One of the most insidious things about the fiscal trajectory we're on is that it will slowly, inevitably, rob the public of the ability to make choices, to say, I prefer this and not that. I want A and not B, because so much of the spending will be locked in by interest, by healthcare costs, by these other factors. And at that point, the public's along for the ride, and that's not right. So what we need is, in addition to making the inside game work, to getting a deal that both sides in Washington can work with and get behind, we need to work on getting the public into the conversation and getting a deal that they can live with. Because fundamentally, this is part of deciding what kind of country we live in. And that is the public's decision to make. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, that tees us up nicely for a discussion of the political dynamics and some of the dilemmas that we face. And we're doing all of this, of course, as we're having a faux debate, really, on the major issues, focused around 1/2 of 1/8 of the budget. And as the House went through its exercise with a quite commendable and remarkable open rule, I was particularly tickled by one amendment that passed, which cut out funding for President Obama's teleprompter. When the president heard about this, he was speechless. As you've heard, as we all know, actually solving these problems is extraordinarily difficult, even if we had a fully functional political system operating on all cylinders. We have to make a segue from short-term needs, with I among the many believing that we have a fragile economy and cutting right now is a very dangerous exercise, to the longer term and providing some assurances that we'll actually do something. We have substantive difficulties about figuring out what exactly to do. Those are particularly acute, it seems to me, as we've heard this morning, on the healthcare front. When you have a system that's half public and half private, and where actors aren't just all in the public sector or all in the private sector, the ability of people who make up a very substantial share of the economy and of the intelligence factor in the economy to shift costs from one place to another means that any of the kinds of changes we want to impose on Medicare are not necessarily going to stick through the whole system and may blow up in our faces. And we don't even know exactly how we can do an appropriate mix of fiscal and monetary policy to get through all of these things. Then we've got the dilemma that comes to any political system, that comes to many of the decisions that we make that are the basic factor of human nature. I was actually reflecting upon this 3 weeks ago as I was preparing one evening for my colonoscopy the next morning, and going through the very difficult and vile exercise necessary to prepare, and thinking about how much of human nature is involved in the willingness to take short-term pain, which is there and immediate and clear, for the if-come maybe of long-term gain. And that's true whether you're waiting for the visit from your gastroenterologist or sitting in the dentist chair. But there you have authority figures who we tend to trust, telling us that it's worth it to do so. If you have a political system like the American one, where built into our culture is a distrust of politicians and political figures, when those political figures say to the American people, trust us, this is going to hurt, but there's a significant benefit to come down the road, you've got a much larger obstacle to overcome. And that's why Daniel Patrick Moynihan said repeatedly that we don't do significant change in social policy without broad bipartisan leadership consensus. And when we do such things, it throws those policies into turmoil and creates even greater fissures. And, of course, as we've heard and repeatedly and know, this is made more difficult by the public sense of what is actually in the budget. When you have not just a belief that foreign aid is a larger component, but that it makes up 25 to 30% of the federal budget and the public wants it slashed to 10%, I keep thinking that the people responsible for smart power ought to get out there and say, look, we'll take an even bigger hit than that. We'll go to 3% of the budget. So, all of that if we had a political system on all cylinders, and we don't. We have a thoroughly dysfunctional process. I've been in Washington for 41 years now, and I would say, even moving aside the tendency to believe that in my day it was better, and it wasn't all that great in my day, but this is the worst and most dysfunctional that I have seen it. And it's reinforced by many of the changes outside, including the highly partisan media that have developed. I wrote a couple of weeks ago that if Fox News decided next week that it was going to change its fundamental message every evening to, can't we all just get along? This president may not have ideas that we really agree with, but he's a good man and we can work together. Within weeks, we would have a competitor, maybe call it Wolf News, that would be pounding away at the message that Fox has because it's a business model that works and other business models don't. Of course, the dysfunction is built now upon a polarization. The ideological polarization, as the National Journal ratings from last year show, is sharper than we have seen it. And actually, you can go beyond those to look at much longer historical records done by political scientists. But last year, it was striking that in the Senate, for the first time ever, the most liberal Republican was to the right of the most conservative Democrat. And on the House side, you had 9 Democrats who ventured over into Republican territory, and most of those were defeated in November. So that makes it difficult. Made even more difficult by the primary process that pulls people who are not necessarily going to gravitate to either end towards the ends, and by the nature of the permanent campaign, where there is no season of governing and no attempt to build broader coalitions, but rather gain leverage because what matters when the consequences of winning or losing majorities are like this instead of, as when I first came here, like that, you can rationalize almost any objective to move people apart. Hence, of course, Mitch McConnell's two quite remarkable statements. The one that, well, of course we didn't work with the president on health care or any of these other issues, because if we had, he would have been perceived as having victories, and that would have hurt us politically. And the second, earlier this year, that his number one objective was to make Barack Obama a one-term president. Now, even if that is your objective, you'd think you would start by saying, our number one objective is to create jobs, to get an economy moving, to solve the debt crisis, and then move on to that. But he was being honest. So we know where he is and where they are. I think it becomes even more difficult as a consequence of all of these things when you look at what McConnell and his allies did to try to achieve their number one objective in the past 2 years, which was to defeat the health reform bill. And so they took positions that basically were, we will create a Medicare Bill of Rights, and we pledge to Americans that we will protect every dollar of Medicare spending from now into perpetuity. And we heard earlier the favorable comments about John McCain's attempt to remove the employer-provided tax breaks and move us away from an employer-based system. Well, during the course of the debate over the health care plan, we had Republican leader after Republican leader get up and say this plan would destroy the employer-based system. And then, of course, we had attacks that include now, in the effort to repeal the bill, or at least parts of it, that start with aiming at all of the cost-cutting measures, including the independent panel regulating Medicare. Now, is it possible to segue from that into exactly the opposite positions? Yes, it is, because another feature of human nature, especially in the modern age, is that we don't remember things that were said a week ago, much less last year, but it makes it much, much more difficult. So where do we go from here, and how can we make this work in a fashion where people can see what Ann's paper points out so clearly, and what we all know, that the long-term pain is very clear and is virtually certain, is not just an if-come maybe, that the short-term pain is going to be worth it. It's going to be difficult to do so, especially if we go through a continuing exercise over the course of the next few months that focuses so much on the discretionary domestic budget and the short-term issues. And I fear that we are not going to resolve these issues for a significant period of time. For one thing, it seems to me pretty clear now what the strategy of John Boehner and his allies is, which is to try and do 2-week extensions after 2-week extensions, each one calling for another $2 billion cut in the current year's discretionary budget, and try and make any shutdown one that makes it look like the Democrats have decided to cause enormous short-term pain for almost nothing, just a couple of $1 billion. Now, I'm not sure that's going to work for very long. I'm still kind of surprised that Democrats haven't tried to do more of what Chuck Schumer clearly attempted to do in his speech at the Center for American Progress yesterday, and turn the focus to that longer term and larger problem, and actually meet the test that many of the Republican leaders have put out there, which is to say, let's focus on entitlements, and to say to the president, as Boehner did, trust us, Mr. President. If you make some proposals or even broad willingness to look at these entitlement programs, we will not immediately jump up and rip you to shreds. Of course, that pledge could work for John Boehner, but it won't necessarily work for the junior members whose role model is not John Boehner but Jim DeMint. And I call them Junior DeMints. And it's not easy to make it work in this process. And at the same time, because we're going to have multiple decision points and we've got the debt limit coming up, it may be that the lesson we can learn from the past is to hope for at least a short-term shutdown of the government, something that will jolt the two sides into a realization that they're playing with live ammunition here, even though it will have potentially serious deleterious effects on the economy and on our credit rating, to force them, as we saw in 1996, to come together and actually work on some of these larger problems. Unlike Newt Gingrich's rewriting history in his op-ed in the Post a week or so ago in the Outlook section, this was not some great triumph. The shutdown was an enormous setback and humiliation for Republicans, and the Speaker then came back and said, hey, if we're going to win re-election as a party, we've got to work together with the president. That might happen this time. Whether John Boehner could be a Newt Gingrich under those circumstances, or Democrats would be willing to go along with that, is another deeper and more troubling question.
I've been on a couple of panels this winter with Norm and Joe particularly, and it's always hard to follow Norm. But the part of this panel that I was focusing on was the title was the Lessons from the Past. And there are some lessons that I think, looking around the room here, a lot of you and Ruth and others of you, Ann, would agree that are pretty quickly identified. Bipartisanship is going to be required in terms of how to move forward. Everything has to be on the table. Leadership from the White House. Those, I think, may be obvious. But there are some that, from my past experience, that may not be quite so obvious, and it may be pretentious on my part to even suggest them as a guide for informing how we might go forward. And so it's going to be a little bit in the weeds, as you might expect. From my experience, unfortunately, with budget battles beginning with 1982, 1985, 1987, 1990, the government shutdown, the winter of 95, 96, the 97 agreement, and the 2001, I think there are a few lessons that I took out of this, and you'll probably say, what the heck, Haugland, those are so darn obvious. But on the off chance you might not have thought of them, let me give you my 6 possible lessons for going forward. And the first one, I think, is agree and set a specific goal. Sounds pretty obvious, and one would think pretty straightforward. And over the last many budget battles that I've been involved in, the goal was a balanced federal budget. And quite frankly, I'm struck a little bit, my career in this town now going on over 30-some years, how that goal has morphed into, quote, balance, not including Social Security surplus, to balance the primary budget, which excludes net interest, to reduce the annual deficit to 3%, or, as we discussed here in the previous panel, hit a goal of debt to GDP of 60%. And our goals in 1982, Graham Redmond Hollings, 1985, and the 1997 was a balanced federal budget, simple, clean, and understandable to the American public, an absolute number. The shift I perceive today to a goal that's some ratio of debt held by the public to a variable unknown, Joe's argument, I think I've heard, to some projected GDP that we're not sure we can project very well. All this, I think, reflects a problem that's going to be required as it relates to your presentation of convincing the American public we know what it is that we're trying to accomplish here. But quite frankly, this will not work unless we don't set a specific goal, whatever it is, and agree to that goal up front and move forward. That's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, agree on a starting point. Now, this is really for budget geeks in the crowd here. This is the issue of the baseline, an endless debate. Do we measure from where we know we are today, say 2010 or 2008, or where we think current policy will have us in 2015? What is current law? Or what are the economic assumptions, pre-reform, post-reform? Do we include contingency funds for a war or for emergencies? Let me simply say that depending on the specific goal we've set out in my lesson number 1, it will determine how you reach that goal, depends upon the starting point. And to me, this is, quite frankly, it's been reflected in this debate, ongoing debate on the Hill over this very small portion of the budget. $100 billion is something you can grasp. We'll save $100 billion. But if we get starting to move into the direction which I think we have to go, which I'm not opposed to, percent of GDP. This is going to get a little bit more difficult. So, but you got to agree, guys, to what it is, what the starting point is that we're moving from. That's lesson number 2. Lesson number 3, and maybe not surprising coming from somebody that's spent a quarter of a century on the Senate Budget Committee, adopt a budget resolution as a blueprint. Once you have the goals and once you have the baselines, then you must, I think, have to adopt a blueprint moving forward. In the 35-year history of the Budget Act, Congress has failed 5 times to not adopt a budget blueprint. And sadly, 4 of those times have all been since 2002. It just so happens the failures to adopt a blueprint have occurred in even-numbered years: 2002, 2004, 2006, and 2010. Now, these are not perfect blueprints, but all the major budget agreements, if we ever can get to an agreement, that led to substantive law changes in the last century follow the adoption of a budget resolution. So, yes, it's kind of your old beat, but adopt a budget resolution, Congress. Once you get it, put it together, put a blueprint down. And that leads to my lesson number 4. Use the tools in the Budget Act to enact the policies. My focus on why you need to have an agreement, a goal set, and then a budget resolution is that once you adopt a budget resolution, then you can use the tools that have been used on all the major agreements of the past, the lessons from the past, and that's the reconciliation process. If there is no budget resolution, there is no ability to use an expedited, non-filibusterable, if there's such a word, reconciliation process. And I consider this to be a pretty important lesson. I think as I look around the room here, many of the former staff on the Hill will know this and understand this. It's not the leadership task forces. It's not commission reports. Joe and I were on the Rivlin Domenici study. It's not the Bowles-Simpson. That's not what will be achieved. Those in fact are quite even more general than even a budget resolution. But putting the real policy in place requires the committees of jurisdiction with the experts and the career staff to do the real hard work of drafting the legislation. And the only way then the goals are going to become reality is with real legislation, not processes or commission reports. The 1990, 1993, 1997 balanced budget agreements were accomplished only after there was a broad agreement on principles. Those goals were then outlined in a budget resolution, and then they were finalized in a budget, in the budget reconciliation process with legislation. So lesson 4, use the tools you have available, Congress. Don't reinvent the wheel. Lesson number 5, create incentives, political penalties for not achieving. Boy, I know how many times have I used repeatedly in this town, and some others in this room have also, Rudy Penner's admonishment: the problem is not the process, the problem is the problem. But failing to live up to your stated goal should have political consequences, and that at least was our attempt, or one of the attempts, with Graham-Rudman-Hollings in 1985. Remember, that law, by the way, was placed on a piece of legislation that was designed to increase the statutory debt limit, as I recall, up to $2 trillion. $2 trillion, 1985, not that long ago. Did it work? Some say no. I'm not so sure. It did focus the attention on debt and deficits, and maybe helped lead to what I consider did lead to some of the other agreements of the 1990, 1993 Democratic Budget Bill, and eventually the 1997 Balanced Budget Agreement. By the way, I'm struck by the fact that yesterday on the floor, Senator Kerry's statement said that I take a backseat to no one about fiscal policy responsibility. I was there fighting for Graham-Rudman-Hollings deficit reduction. Not my recollection, but that's okay. To me, the similarities of the debate today are very much akin to the attention the American public gave to debt and deficits back in the mid-1980s, maybe the consequences of your presentations in terms of the consciousness raising. So process is not the answer, but it can be an effective mechanism for enforcing the goals that have been agreed to, and I believe some of the work here by the Committee on Responsible Federal Budget and others in Back to Black outline a procedure, a process that we go. And finally, and I don't take complete credit for this, Sherry Reedy down here kind of gave me the thought of this the other day. It's pie in the sky. This is my final lesson. There are a lot of others that we could take, but in the interest of time, it's pie in the sky, I'm sure. My lesson number 6 is don't sign pledges and petitions. I know, unfortunately, no nice way to say this. And I'm a friend of John Rother. Probably not the other one I'm going to mention here. I think Grover Norquist and the American Tax Reform Group on the right, and John, my friend on the left with AARP on the left, do the country a major disservice by corralling members into signing pledges on taxes, Social Security, and other programs. Oh, well, good. I questioned the contract with America, got myself in trouble with Mr. Gingrich. I question the pledge to America. When numbers are put forward in political campaigns that lock in members, e.g., $100 billion, on impossible positions later in the real world of legislation. So maybe it's good politics, I'm sure it is, I'm not a politician, but bad budget policy. And the growing use of these kinds of pledges makes reaching bipartisanship agreements, which is critical at the end, even more problematic. A lesson that I would see close here going forward is that all members of Congress sign a pledge that they will not sign pledges. Thank you.
Always great to go last on a panel of this quality. Bill, as I've told you before, if you ever want to become a Democrat, we welcome you. We can guarantee you good health care coverage. And we had Scott reminding us that we can't be too wonky to communicate with the public, and we had Bill saying that he thought he had to get down in the weeds. It reminds me of when I left OMB, I sent an email to all of my colleagues, and I said, look, I've been here for 8 years to the day. I've got this budget stuff nailed. If you want to do a good job, all you have to do is follow 2 simple rules. Number 1, don't sweat the small stuff. And number 2, the devil is in the details. That's the whole story. What I did was I came up with a bunch of observations really under 3 topics. Number 1, why is it so hard to get people to focus on this problem? Number 2, why do we need to get them to focus on this problem sooner rather than later? And number 3, what do we do to try to get people to focus on this problem? And I'm starting out with this is Norm, one of yours, and it's a very simple aphorism. It is always difficult to get people to sacrifice to solve a problem that they don't know they have. Lived through this once before in the 1997 budget negotiations. There was a kitty left over. 1997, I'll be honest, was a chip shot relative to 1993. There was a kitty left over. It was going to be divided so that people had goodies, and the numbers were split in half. The Republicans got half, the Democrats got half. And my colleagues in the White House could not understand why the Republicans would not go for a deal where out of each of our halves we take equal amounts and fix the alternative minimum tax in perpetuity. And the Republicans wouldn't go for it, and my colleagues couldn't understand it, and I had to explain to them that nobody knew that the alternative minimum tax was a problem in 1997. So everybody figured, I'm going to take the money and do some stuff that's fun. Why am I going to solve a problem that people don't know they have? There is still denial on the deficit and debt problem. One reason why that is true is that this is an unprecedented problem in the United States. We have never had a debt as large relative to our GDP as where we are right now, except at the end of World War II, when economic and fiscal circumstances were enormously different. And immediately after World War II, the debt fell like a stone. We're not in a situation where we can turn things around that way. So people don't understand it, and they don't understand when the problem is going to arise, and therefore it's hard to sell a solution. There's another problem we have, and that is people like me have spent the last quarter of a century in effect crying wolf about this problem. We've been saying that the baby boom was going to start to retire, entitlement costs were going to start to grow. It took us a little while to see the cost of health care rising as fast as it did. But people have heard about this problem for a long time, and now all of a sudden they hear people talking again, and I think there's a lot of reaction out there that, well, you always said it was a problem, it never bit me, so why am I worried about it now? Both Norm and Bill have pointed out the extent to which we have political extremes right now who are resistant to any measure of compromise. And the fact that when you look at political behavior in terms of voting, you've got totally disparate distributions within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party with virtually no overlap. And as I think about that, I remember something that Lee Hamilton said once when he was talking to a group of his constituents when I was working for him back in the late 1980s, when we thought we had a serious budget problem. And Mr. Hamilton started off a paragraph by saying, reducing the federal budget deficit is the second highest priority of every member of Congress. And you're getting the joke just about as fast as the audience did, but within 10 seconds, everybody in the room was rolling on the floor laughing, because the conclusion of that proposition is by the time they all take care of their highest priorities, they haven't got a snowball's chance in hell of taking care of their second priorities. Everybody has different interests. Somebody doesn't want to cut taxes. Somebody doesn't want to save any money out of Social Security. They've all signed pledges. And that is one of the problems with the deck that we've been dealt at this point. There's another problem, and that is that on both sides of the aisle, people almost always believe if we hang on 2 years, we can fix this problem our way. You have Republicans who look at the last election right now and believe we're going to take the Senate. Barack Obama is going to be a one-term president. You have Democrats who think that the momentum is shifting, and that if they hold out and don't deal with this problem now, they will be in a stronger position 2 years from now with a second-term president, and that helps to give people the incentive to procrastinate. Our last panel and others earlier on have pointed out how difficult it is to convince people to take difficult steps in a recession, particularly when we have such incredible unemployment as we have now, and all of the dislocation in the labor market, people wanting full-time jobs but only getting part-time, discouraged workers who aren't even being counted as unemployed, etc. That's why it's hard. Why do we have to do it anyway? Proposition number one, diamonds are forever, and so is debt. You have to service it in perpetuity. It is well within the realm of possibility at the rate we're going that before too long we will have collected enough debt that the United States of America will no longer be a going concern. That is the financial crisis scenario. And let me just tack a side point to that. Another one of my former bosses, John Spratt, once made the point that if you want to destroy people's confidence in the federal government, the best thing you can do is run up a lot of debt. The reaction you get in polls is the federal government is not worth it for me. I pay a lot in taxes and I don't see anything in return. Well, first of all, let's put national defense aside, which, yeah, you don't see it, but you're glad it's there. But the other part of the point is, to the extent that the federal government is collecting hundreds of billions of dollars in individual income taxes that go to pay interest on the debt, that complaint about the federal government is absolutely true. You're paying all those taxes and you are not getting anything in return because you get nothing for interest that is paid on the debt. And the more debt we accumulate, the closer we're getting to that point where people can very rationally be very cynical about what government does for them. My concern when I think about how urgent this problem is comes from a scenario that I found myself painting. CED was interested in trying to explain what would happen if we did not act on the budget problem. And there's a paper out there on the table which is called This Way Down to a Debt Crisis. And in the first section, I had to write a scenario for how we would get into trouble failing to act on the debt. One of the sets of circumstances that occurred to me very early on was, imagine we get into the next presidential campaign and we have not yet addressed this problem. Think about the last problem. One candidate says, I will not raise your taxes, period, no way, no how. The other presidential candidate says, I won't raise the taxes of anyone who has an income, any family that has an income below $250,000. $250,000 being the borderline, in my perception, of the lower upper class. Anybody below that point, you get home free, and of course the numbers don't work once you start making those kinds of promises. We have the promise that we're not going to cut Medicare. We have the promise that we're not going to cut Social Security. If we have another round of those promises in 2012, and if the observers outside see that in the financial markets and come to the conclusion that with those promises with all these options off the table, we are not going to see the federal government of the United States address its budgetary problems until at the earliest 2017, because that's after these four guys who have already tied their own hands will be out of office. You look at that picture, and at that point, I would not be surprised if the players in the financial markets come to the conclusion that the United States cannot be trusted as a debtor. So when people want to know about the tipping point, that's one of my strongest concerns, and I would add to that just the realization that we all ought to keep in mind. If you're in a crowded theater and somebody yells fire, people do not stand up and get into an orderly 2x2 line and walk slowly and cautiously towards the door. They run. And that is what we can see happening in the financial markets if we get there. In short, what we're doing as the world's leading financial institution is we are relying on the rest of the world, given some of the pictures that Carlos showed a little while ago. We are relying on the rest of the world to keep screwing up worse than we are so that we continue to be an attractive destination for capital. And the problem with that strategy is the bigger they are, the harder they fall. We're selling debt at such large amounts, with more than half of it at the margin going overseas. When people decide that they don't trust us anymore, they have so much of our paper that they could conceivably dump into the markets on their way to the door in the crowded theater, that the downside for us could be very, very serious. So we have two things we need to do. Number one, we have to talk to people and convince them that if we don't act, the consequences would be very bad for them and for the whole country. This is something that Ann has been working on, and this is a very good reason to hold a conference and to have these kinds of discussions. We also need to explain to people, and this isn't easy, but Erskine Bowles has been doing it fairly well, we need to explain to people that there are benefits if we do fix it. We will be taking a weight off the shoulders of this economy. And Erskine does that, in my experience, quite well, and I think maybe gives people a little ray of light at the end of the tunnel. It's not easy to move people on this issue. I've heard people who make the argument that we need the President of the United States to step forward and put his plan on the table. Personally, I think when you send up a trial balloon as President of the United States in this situation, it gets shot at, and your best ideas become discredited when all the interest groups line up against it. I give the President a lot of credit when he said around the time of his State of the Union that if we are going to get into the canoe from opposite sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, we've got to do it at the same time. Nobody goes first. I think that was a good metaphor for describing what we have to do. My problem with it was that the president did not say, and we're getting into the canoe together tomorrow at 9 a.m. By failing to put that marker out there and to get people moving, I think we had some weakness there. I'm going to finish with one last little story that might give us a ray of hope, but I'm not sure it still applies. At the time of the final vote in the Senate on the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which was another piece of legislation that was big and potentially very important and passed on a bipartisan basis, I found myself sitting in the Senate gallery, and I was listening to a member, whom I will not name, who came to the climax of his presentation, and he said the most important reason why the Tax Reform Act of 1986 is a bad idea is because I am holding in my hand a public opinion poll, and 75% of the American people believe that their taxes are going to go up. Now, sitting at my side was my briefcase, which included the Joint Tax Committee analysis, which indicated that 75% of the American people would get a tax cut from the 1986 Tax Reform Act. So at least half of the American people were wrong and fundamentally misunderstood what that piece of legislation was going to do in a pessimistic direction, but it still passed. So there was a potential for leaders to evoke a certain amount of trust and get people at least to be willing to go along with something that, in my personal opinion, turned out to be a very good idea. Now, would that kind of leadership pay off today? I don't know. I'm not sure, because clearly the American people can go to the medium of instantaneous miscommunication, the internet, and they can find any number of websites with any number of testimonials to convince them that all of their misconceptions are absolutely correct. And we all know that if you saw it on the internet, it's got to be true. But if we're going to get out of this game, and it's going to be very, very difficult, there's really no other path that I can point other than having leaders in the Congress and in the White House at least suggesting in their leadership that what we need to do is sit down and talk without any preconditions, with everything on the table. I hope that the president will do that. I fear the consequences if we don't do that soon. That's about as optimistic as I can be, and I'll stop.
Well, I think the title of this panel might be Dreary and Drearier. Now that we're all thoroughly bummed out, thank you for trying to end on a quasi-optimistic note. Let's talk a little bit about how Anne's fundamental point, the human face, either in past legislative/policy battles or in the current battle, has been effectively used or could be used, do you think, to move the debate in a positive way?
It could, but even that is going to take some bipartisan leaders coming together to explain in a powerful fashion why this is a priority that supersedes other priorities. And one of the things that troubles me, it's not just Grover Norquist's pledge. If you haven't read it, go to the little interview that Ezra Klein did with Grover Norquist yesterday, which makes it clear, something that ought to be clear but hasn't, that the top priority of many is not reducing deficits and debt. It is demolishing government. And if that's your top priority, you're going to do everything you can to gloss over the human cost of debt reduction. And, at the same time, it's very difficult to overcome a lot of Democrats who want to look in a rifle shot way at the costs of making any changes in Social Security or Medicare without looking at the costs of not making those changes. So you're going to have not just people getting into the canoe together, but doing something more. What I wish Obama had done at his State of the Union message was to say, I've got this commission, I don't agree with all of it, you don't either, but I am demanding that Congress take it and put it into legislative language now, and that we have an immediate debate on what's there and what the consequences are. And what I would hope the President would do now is to do a Ross Perot, done by somebody whose tray table is in its full upright and locked position this time. But do a television address as the educator-in-chief with handmade charts that explain what the problem is, what the budget is, and what the human consequences are if we don't deal with this problem. You don't have to take particular solutions and put them on the table at the moment and get shot at, but you can let people know why dealing with foreign aid, earmarks, waste, fraud, and abuse will not solve the problem. Why, if we don't solve the problem, everybody from the youngest to the oldest and future generations will suffer mightily, and why we're going to have to focus on big things that people do not want to focus on.
Anybody else?
I am a big fan of Ross Perot's pie charts, if not everything else. It was his moment in 92 was extremely useful in a public sense. And when you're talking about getting the public enlisted on this, you always go back to fundamentals every time, and you keep repeating them as often as it's necessary. And something like that, that kind of leadership from the top, could help move people forward in the debate. I think it can't just be from the top. I think there's stuff that can be done on the grassroots. People talked earlier about budget simulators, viral communication on the internet. Remember that good information can travel virally as well as bad information, and you have to make that work for you. But it is that sense of fundamentals and priorities that really is the key to unlocking the public side of the equation, I think.
Accepting all of that, and maybe one part of the message, but certainly not all of it. One part of the message is we are the United States. We are the world's leader. We are not going to wind up borrowing money from the rest of the world to finance what we're doing. Erskine Bowles told a story the other day, which he attributed to John Tanner. Consider the implications. We have a treaty with Taiwan which suggests that if they are attacked by China, we will come to their defense. Yeah. But just note that if that ever happens, we have to borrow from China to finance it. It would be interesting to see the reaction of the American people if they think about, well, we've got to make choices so that we are not in that position, so that we are not dependent on another country to that extent and in that extreme circumstance.
Despite my gloom and doom also, and I share a lot of what Norm's concerns are about the Congress, if anybody listened yesterday to the joint session of Congress with the Prime Minister of Australia, Mrs. Gillard, she basically gave the speech that was the most uplifting speech that I've heard in a long time about why we are Americans and why we come to deal with these issues and why we will remain a force in the world. And I I tell you, we need more people like, unfortunately, the Prime Minister of Australia telling us that we can address these issues.
Ma'am. No, you right there.
Gillian Garcia. Question for everyone on the panel. Does the President understand the problem? He gives me the impression that he doesn't. Does his administration understand the problem? They don't appear to. Do the leaders in Congress of both parties understand the problem?
Actually, I'll give you my crack at that. Absolutely, yes, the President understands the problem. Absolutely, his advisors understand the problem. It is not a failure of intellect. It's a failure, to put it bluntly, of courage on his part, or to put it in a nicer way, a difference of opinion over the best way to a goal that he and they share with everybody in the room. I think the answer at the leaders of Congress is behind closed doors at the very top. Yes, they do. They understand that on the Democratic side that entitlements need to be cut, including Social Security, and it can't all be done on the revenue side. And I think even see Tom Coburn and see the reason that the House Republicans gave for not supporting Simpson Bowles. They do understand that we need more revenue. It's just a failure of political will and a confidence that the political system will reward courage when there is some evidence that the political system rewards politics as opposed to courage.
I would just embellish that by saying I think lots of people understand the problem. One question is whether they make it the top priority problem to deal with. And, both parties have, I think, some very substantial culpability here. But if this were the top problem going back to 2001, we wouldn't have gone from $5.6 trillion in surpluses to huge debts because we not only cut taxes, but we had enormous spending that we refused very consciously to pay for. And not only refused to pay for it, but very consciously sought subterfuges through supplemental appropriations and in other ways to finance two wars, and then manipulated the budget process, including reconciliation for tax cuts and a Medicare prescription drug program. So, that's one element of this. You can understand the problem and still, as a president, decide politically that you're going to support $3 trillion in lost revenue over 10 years and tax cuts, which are insane things to do if this is the biggest problem, but you're putting a political gain or traction ahead of it. And I think you've got that difficulty on both sides. Lots of smart people understand the problem. They don't make it the top priority.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I just wanted to, Norm had raised the National Journal article a couple of weeks ago about coming apart, and I just pulled out something that I gave another talk on. But Ronald Brownstein made a comment in there which really struck me. I think there's no question about Congress in terms of people's intent, except for this one comment he made, that throughout congressional history, the most respected legislators, from Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas to Lyndon Johnson to Bob Dole to Ted Kennedy, have been those who, through the force of personality or intellect, have been able to assemble coalitions and forge compromises that would not have coalesced without them. I don't see it right now.
Also, I think if you're looking at kind of, unfortunate term, the dumbbell in the Congress, you've got some extremes on either side. The president understands the problem. I think he believes that the time is not right. There is not sufficient understanding and education in the Congress and in the public to move forward. And you can believe that or not. We have two groups of people in the Congress who will make it very hard to move forward because their votes are unobtainable. On the far right, we have the supply-side tax cutters. If you cut taxes enough, revenues will increase. On the far side, you have the supply-side spenders who believe that if you build enough highways and bridges, revenues will increase. Yes, revenues will increase because the economy will become more productive. They save me 5 minutes in my commute going back home, and that's going to make me more productive. I'm with Martin Bailey on the question of the efficacy of those kinds of investments. Those votes are not obtainable in this environment, so you're working from a very, very slim population in the center of the aisle, and it's not enough.
Cheer us up.
I think there is a fair amount of understanding, at least the folks I've talked to and what I've seen. I think also that something that's been underappreciated outside Washington is the consistency and the strong voice of the budget agencies and the watchdog agencies on this over the years, who started beating the drumbeat about a lack of sustainability when nobody was ready to listen. And I think they have had an impact among staff, among government officials that rose up to the political level. It has more trouble getting out to the public. And I think the other asset is that public concern about this is rising, without question. People are listening, but they're still processing. And I'm concerned, that is the plus. The negative is, of course, that it takes the public a while to process. And the issue may be moving faster than the public's ability to process without some strong intervention.
Or a crisis.
Yeah. We need a crisis to avert a crisis.
Yes, yeah. Which would be too late. Yeah.
So we have some eager folks out there. One more question? Is that okay? Sir?
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. We think we found the people with the answer to all this. It's the American people. The University of Maryland had a survey done, the most comprehensive, statistically valid survey I've yet seen on this, where they gave the American people the time to really go through this budgetary process, 31 line items. They not only cut the budget by $150 billion, they decided they would add taxes. The biggest cuts would come from the Department of Defense, Intelligence Agency, Department of Homeland Security. And they made it very clear that it was time to raise taxes across all income levels, and all income levels responded that their own income level would also have to raise taxes. So if you believe in surveys at all, it was the Program for Public Policy, University of Maryland. We just featured it on a special report we're putting out this week. And all I can tell you is I looked at this and said, the American people deserve a lot more credit than they've been given. If they are not just given knee-jerk reaction, would you cut taxes or would you cut spending or raise taxes where, with very little choice, they're going to react very quickly. But if you give them time to really analyze this problem, they came up with some very sensible answers to it.
Was this a random sample?
Not at all. It was conducted by a professional survey team. Over I think they had 1,200 randomly sampled Americans across the U.S. All political parties.
Yeah.
All political parties. It's quite a survey to go through.
And these are the same people that vote too, but that's okay.
That's correct.
It was actually, I'm familiar with that. I think it's a very innovative survey technique. I think it got at something very intriguing, which you also see in other kind of deliberative efforts and forums on the budget issue. That when you get people together and give them some time to think about this, the public deals with this quite well. The public understands, setting priorities and following through on them. But you have to give them time. And that's what they normally, time and information, and that's what they normally don't get.
Alan Simpson made a similar point in his remarks earlier this week. He says he will go anywhere in Wyoming where you can have both the local Democratic and Republican parties inviting him. And he typically sits down with groups of citizens, and he says in 2 hours he has them understanding that we need to put everything on the table to address the problem. And yes, they're willing to sacrifice. The problem, he says, is he doesn't have 2 hours for every small group in the state of Wyoming. So that's the constraint.
Let me just a couple of points here. One is it's not just Steve Cull's survey. It's all the efforts that the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, the Concord Coalition, and others have done over the years in going out and putting people through extensive budget exercises. But you have Pete Peterson, who's ready to put $1 billion out there, and we're not going to educate the American people in that fashion except over a period of many, many years. And while voters can look at this in some fashion, look at the voters who matter. And I would urge you to take a look at, just for example, 4 people in the course of the next year. Orrin Hatch, Dick Lugar, Olympia Snow, and Bob Corker. All are up.
Because you won't get another chance.
That's right. All are up.
Or you can have all the chances in the world.
Yeah. They recognize what happened to Bob Bennett and Bob Inglis and Lisa Murkowski, and they don't have write-in laws the same as Alaska. And we had Dick Lugar, who's facing a very credible challenge from his right, one of the great all-time legislators by any stretch, and who voted for the House budget cuts, even after saying that these were a terrible mix of cuts. We have Orrin Hatch basically trying to move to the right of everybody else so that he can win over the Tea Party. And these are people who believe, because they have such deep-seated hostility towards everybody who served in government, that it's all waste, fraud, and abuse, and it will all melt away, and earmarks. And you're going to find, I'm afraid, similar phenomena. Olympia Snowe, who voted for that budget plan, and they all face challenges from a sliver of the electorate. That's what drives this process now, and it's going to drive it on both sides because it doesn't matter whether you could create a model deliberative process with 1,200 upstanding, randomly sampled citizens. They're not going to be the ones making the decisions unless we can frame this in a very different way than we have.
By the way, Jim DeMint, Mike Lee, and Rand Paul, Kentucky, Utah, and South Carolina voted against it yesterday because it didn't go far enough.
And even
we're the only ones that voted against it.
Even our hero Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, who's been out there trying to do something, said after Rand Paul's plan to cut $500 billion immediately from the budget, which would mean, among other things, cutting the FDA's budget by 61%. He said, well, I could cut $350 billion out of the budget today and nobody would notice. That's not a reflection of reality.
Well, I thought we were going to be able to end on a happy note, but apparently reality intervened. Ann, did you want to say anything?
Reality bites.
To close, thank you all for coming. Absolutely terrific panels, including this one. And thank you all for caring about this issue.